Across the disciplines, the ability to think critically is one of the most important things that we teach our students. The capacities to reflect on one's own beliefs and evaluate the evidence for claims are invaluable, not only for academic pursuits, but also for simply being an informed and an engaged citizen. The philosopher John Dewey, often considered the father of modern-day critical thinking, defines critical thinking as active, persistent, careful consideration of a belief or supposed form of knowledge in light of the grounds that support it and further the conclusions to which it tends. While Dewey offers his thoughts, defining critical thinking is really surprisingly complicated. Often we think of critical thinking as a set of purely or primarily cognitive skills. That is, the abilities to understand the conclusion of an argument, to weigh the evidence for a claim, to break an argument down into a series of premises and conclusions, or even to generate counterexamples. In fact, it is not uncommon for instructors of critical thinking to tell students to set aside their feelings when evaluating an argument. The important thing is not how you feel about an argument or whether you like a conclusion, they insist, but whether or not the argument is a good one. That is, whether or not it follows the principles of good reasoning. But the ability to navigate our emotions when engaging with arguments is, as anyone who has ever found themselves in an argument knows, much more than a cognitive capacity. To engage with views other than our own, or to evaluate evidence that pushes back against deeply held belief, requires complex attributes like humility, open-mindedness, and openness to introspection. These characteristics have a cognitive component, but they also involve our affect, our emotions, those capacities, and our understanding of our own and others' identities. When we think about how we might help students to develop these more complex affective capacities, it is helpful to turn to one of the most influential philosophers in the Western tradition, the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. For Aristotle, the key to becoming a good person is the development of virtues, which are habits that dispose people to act in a certain way. For example, a generous person can be called generous because they are in the habit of acting generously and tend to act that way when the situation requires it. Importantly for Aristotle, the only way to become virtuous is to practice. The generous person is not born generous. They become generous by repeatedly performing generous actions until becoming and being generous has become a habit or a disposition of their soul, a second nature. And this practice is not something a person can do only in their mind or all at once. Rather, practicing virtues takes time. It involves the whole person, body and soul, feelings and all. The skills of critical thinking can be similarly understood as virtues in Aristotle's sense. To be willing to change your mind when appropriate, to be open to hearing views of someone you disagree with, to be curious and seeking out evidence, all require the development of cognitive, emotional habits of mind. These abilities are, as philosophers would say, intellectual virtues, and the only way to get better at them is to practice. When thought leaders talk about why critical thinking is valuable, they tend to bring up the 4 points listed on this slide. They talk about perspective taking, when people can see things from more than one perspective. Those people are particularly skilled then in dealing with times of change and transition. Also, critical thinking really counteracts biased thinking and opens and contributes to more accurate decision making. Open-mindedness is often a result of critical thinking, and it contributes to the search for meaning in life by helping one to develop a broader understanding of how people find deeper meaning and purpose in their life. And in terms of resistance to manipulation, individuals with this strength are less swayed by singular events and more resistant to suggestion and manipulation in general. For just a moment, pause and reflect. How do you actually express your critical thinking to others? When do you find that emotions get in the way of your ability to be objective? And when is that most likely to occur for you? In some situations, when we bring too little of our critical thinking to a situation, we may appear as unreflective and or not having much to offer the conversation. In other situations, underuse of critical thinking might mean we are caught up in the emotions or passions and not listening to other opinions. At times like these, when our hot emotions are interfering with cool-headed thinking, we need to really just dial the temperature down. If our thinking is on the right path, then rational arguments should support the conclusion. If we start arguing emotionally, then we're really not trusting the evidence for our opinion. The underuse of critical thinking can be particularly dangerous in a conflict situation and could lead to saying things that are embarrassing or even regrettable. In a situation where it may be easy to become highly emotional, pausing to analyze the situation and what the other person is saying or doing can really help to diffuse the tension. Also, viewing those who are different as wrong is an example of underuse of critical thinking. It may actually be easier to visualize the overuse of critical thinking. Many of us can relate to situations where we have criticized ourselves too harshly. And while it's normal to have a critical part of your mind that motivates us, it's not beneficial to be chronically negative in regard to our own actions and missteps. In fact, an emphasis on the negative or imbalance towards criticism can actually bleed into your dialogue and relationships, lead to actually being too quick to criticize others. The challenge is to offer constructive feedback to others that offers honest pros and cons, positives and negatives, and suggestions for improvement. Others are generally seeking your support to validate their ideas and emotions, not to criticize. Too much evaluation can make them feel disconnected. Critical thinking needs to be accompanied by heavy doses of listening, kindness, social intelligence, and self-regulation. Curiosity can help us in exploring the opinions and ideas of others in a non-critical manner. Overthinking or overuse of critical thinking can lead to what is sometimes called analysis paralysis, an endless quest for all the information and all the points of view in order to make a decision, which actually can be an obstacle in moving forward in the decision-making process. We don't have to know absolutely everything there is to know or to study every possible perspective. In practice, most decisions have to be made with a limited amount of information. The golden mean or golden middle way is the desirable middle between two extremes, excess on one hand and deficiency on the other. So when we are approaching situations, it's helpful to aim for a balance of both the head and the heart, a combination of the slow, methodical, rational thinking while also thinking about and considering the intuitive and personal feelings. Somewhere in this balance lies wisdom. And when we start to get hung up in the minutiae or the details, we can shift and use perspective to help us refocus on the big picture. We need to deliberate and take time for reflection and analysis, but we don't want to perseverate and waste time when it may not be necessary. Essentially, we should strive for the golden mean, but also be aware that we never perfectly achieve less personal bias, less stereotyping, and more healthy logical thinking. Essentially, we are all a work in progress. Once again, I'm going to ask you to just pause for a few moments and reflect and think about the questions on this slide. How do you integrate your emotions or the emotions of others into your critical thinking process? With what people and in what circumstances do you find it difficult to think rationally without being confused by strong emotions? So we need to think about our students and how we teach critical thinking. On this particular slide, you'll see some of the suggestions that have been really uncovered through various research studies that dig into this. In our classrooms and school communities, when we emphasize critical thinking, we need to take into account the emotional dimensions of good thinking. We need to give students practice navigating their emotions when they encounter arguments that trouble them or upset them. We need to offer them strategies for how to do so effectively so they can be good critical thinkers. Perhaps we even need to teach our students how to take a deep breath, to engage in empathetically imagining themselves in the position of someone else, to prepare for that experience of discomfort when they inevitably realize that some of their beliefs may not be true, and to be given space to process these experiences with their classmates. What this looks like in different school communities will, of course, vary depending on the context, but if we accept that critical thinking involves more than just our cognitive capacities, and we want these skills to be transferable outside of the classroom, then we have to attend to critical thinking in all of its dimensions, even and especially how our students feel. Critical thinking goes well beyond memorization, encouraging students to connect the dots between concepts, to solve problems, to think creatively and apply knowledge in new ways. That's where we're heading. Despite myths that critical thinking skills are only applicable to such subjects like science and math, the reality is that these skills, which are based on the evaluation and application of knowledge, are not only vital for success in all subject areas, but they are vital for success in everyday life. So some of the different exercises that we can think about are things like asking questions, especially open-ended questions. These give elementary school students a chance to apply what they've learned and build on their prior knowledge. It allows them to problem solve and think on their feet. It also boosts self-esteem by providing an opportunity for students to express themselves in front of their peers. We like to say that it's important to encourage decision-making as well. Since a large part of teaching critical thinking skills revolves around applying knowledge and evaluating solutions, elementary school teachers can encourage decision-making as much as possible. They can enable students to apply what they've learned to different situations, to weigh the pros and cons of a variety of solutions, and then decide which one works best. Group projects and discussions are another excellent way for elementary school teachers to encourage critical thinking skills. Cooperative learning not only exposes students to the thought processes of their classmates, it expands their thinking and worldview by demonstrating there's no one right way to approach a problem, which leads them then to incorporating different points of view. Some of the very best critical thinking exercises for elementary school students involve exploring concepts from multiple perspectives. This tactic not only establishes that an idea should be assessed from different points of view before an opinion is formed, it also gives students a chance to share their own viewpoints while listening and learning from others. Connecting different ideas is key to teaching critical thinking. For example, elementary school teachers can ask students if they know anyone who has to take a bus to work, and so why would it be important for a person to also have a train schedule? Questions like these help children consider different situations, for example, delayed buses, and potential solutions, taking the train instead, helping them to apply prior knowledge to new contexts. When it comes to inspiring creativity, imagination is key to teaching critical thinking in the elementary school. Teachers really should seek out new ways for students to use information and create something new. Art projects are a great way to do this. Students can also construct inventions, write a story or a poem, create a game, sing a song. Really, in terms of creativity, the sky's the limit. Brainstorming, of course, is a time-honored tradition in elementary education, and it is an excellent learning tool. It's also an excellent critical thinking exercise, especially when paired with visual elements that bring original thinking and classroom discussions to life. Critical thinking enables leaders at every level to understand the impact of their decisions on the school as a whole and ensures both alignment with the mission and vision as well as accountability. Leaders can take charge of their own critical thinking development with a few suggested exercises. For example, get feedback about your critical thinking skills from a trusted boss, colleague, or coach. Are you jumping to conclusions, using reasoned analytical processes as you work towards a goal? Are you able to put aside biases and assumptions during analysis and decision making? What kind of a thinker are you perceived to be, and why? You can also use multiple sources of data to form an information web before making a decision or forming a conclusion. For example, are you asking a lot of questions? Are you identifying stakeholders and their issues and opinions? Are you separating facts from assumptions? Are you using multiple sources of information? Can you analyze information from different perspectives and viewpoints? Of course, leaders really need to take time to think. Ask yourself as a leader, are you raising yourself above the fray when it's important to make decision and take action? Are you aware of distractions getting in the way of your thinking time and taking action to minimize those distractions? Are you finding time and space to let your mind focus and reflect on important issues? And finally, it's always important to ask for input, critique, and opinions from others as you have analyzed alternatives. So are you checking tentative conclusions with others? Are you using peers, coaches, or mentors to critique your thinking process? Are you willing to open your mind to other ideas and alternatives? I think we would all agree that leaders need to think critically, but let's expand a little bit more on what you need to do to think critically. First of all, I think it's important to question assumptions. Critical thinkers are inquisitive and look to find the what and the why behind every proposition. We saw the need for this when our financial markets melted back in 2008. A crisis like that can bring out the best critical thinking because it forces us to question how and why we ended up in trouble. Adopting different perspectives is really powerful. Take advantage of the different genders and cultures represented in today's diverse landscapes. Perhaps, for example, a person who might be an Indian-trained engineer may not view the problem the way one would be who was trained in Iowa. But both may have the same problem-solving toolkit, but their different experiences can provide valuable insights. Also look for potential. Assumption busting and harnessing multiple perspectives are really good deductive skills. Critical thinkers should also have a creative bent that allows them to see opportunities where others see obstacles. Perhaps one leader might see, a problem where a savvy thinker might think of it as an opportunity to do something new and be innovative. There's also the aspect of critical thinking that I think is vital to today's leaders, and that's managing ambiguity, and certainly COVID has taught us that. The speed of businesses and intertwined with global factors and complex supply chains dictate that in the business world you never know all the variables, and I think that applies to education as well. Therefore, I think we all need to get comfortable with operating in an environment where change is constant and rapid decisions are frequently required. In this world of growing uncertainty, one thing is certain: we need sharp critical thinkers who can size up situations, realize potential where others may not, and seize opportunities through prompt and thoughtful decision-making. To conclude, I'm going to ask you again to just pause, apply what we've been talking about here, and evaluate. For example, can you think of a recent example of a COVID-19 related dilemma that your school leaders have dealt with and they use the virtue of critical thinking? Jot down for yourself just what was that dilemma. And then ask yourself, did your leaders follow any of these strategies that we've suggested? Did they ask for feedback? Did they use multiple sources? Did they take time to think? Did they ask others for input? In other words, did they think critically?